Welcome back to my channel. And if you are visiting this channel for the first time, you are also highly welcome. In this lecture, we'll be looking at the thalamic nuclei. The thalamic nuclei is a collection of neural cell bodies that are located within the thalamus. I've done the first lecture series on the thalamus where I described the gross anatomy of the thalamus. You can go and check that lecture up to keep yourself updated. This is also going to enhance a better understanding of this lecture. So the thalamic nuclei is what we'll be focusing on in this lecture, and we'll be establishing the basis onto which the thalamic nuclei is configured, also stating some of the functions that this nuclei exhibits. Thalamus is the largest subcomponent of the diencephalon. If you go through my lecture on diencephalon, you will know that we describe the diencephalon as being sandwiched between the cerebrum hemisphere and also the midbrain. This is where we have the cerebrum hemisphere here harrowed in green, and inferior to this region, we have the midbrain here that is harrowed in black. So in between these two regions is where we have the diencephalon. Also at the central part of the diencephalon, we have the third ventricle that is harrowed here in yellow. We know that the third ventricle is one of the ventricles of the central nervous system, and this is located between the cerebrum hemisphere and also the midbrain. Around the third ventricle is where we have a number of structures that are referred to as the diencephalon. So if you look at this region that is carved out in dotted black, you see that you have a number of structures surrounding the third ventricle, and these structures are referred to as the diencephalon. Out of all these structures, the thalamus is the largest subcomponent of these structures, and this is what is harrowed here in red. So we say that the thalamus is one of the structural components of the diencephalon. As a matter of fact, it is the largest subcomponent. So what is this thalamus structurally made up of? It is made up of a mass of gray matter, and a mass of gray matter are a collection of neural cell bodies. So if you have a collection of neural cell bodies within the central nervous system, this is referred to as the nucleus. But when you have collection of neural cell body outside central nervous system, they are referred to as ganglion. So if you look at the configuration of the neuron, this is what a neuron looks like. You have the cell body here harrowed in red, and you have an extension from the neural cell body which is harrowed here in yellow, and this is referred to as the axon. So if you look at the axon, along the length of the axon, you have the wrapping of the myelin sheaths. This myelin sheaths is established as a result of the Schwann cell that are seen to run around the axon. As they run around the axon, they are creating a sheath-like covering around the axon, and this is what is referred to as myelin sheath. This myelin sheath is whitish in color. That is why you see that the region of the brain that you have deposits, a collection of axonal extension, are usually whitish in color because of the coloration that the myelin sheath creates around that point. So if you look at this region where we have the neural cell body, this region, we do not have the myelin sheath covering around this region because the Schwann cells are not seen to extend towards the neural cell body. They're only limited to the axonal region of the neuron. So if you have a collection of neural cell body, this is another neuron, then you have another neuron. So you have them collected together in this region here that is carved out in dotted black. You see that you have a collection of neural cell bodies. So when you have this kind of presentation, they are referred to as nucleus. And of course, they have to be located within the central nervous system. So this is the kind of configuration that you see within the thalamus. So if you try to drive into the thalamus, you see that we have collection points of neural cell body, and this is what we refer to as the nucleus. Also to add that the neural cell bodies is what forms the major structural component of the thalamus. This is to say that we also have a point within the thalamus where we have the deposit of the white matter. But this is only seen in a very minute region or space of the thalamus. So we see that the collection of the neural cell body, which are referred to as the nuclear point, is what takes the chunk of the thalamus. By the time we drive into the different nuclei of the thalamus, we see that the thalamus also has deposit of white matter within it. Using this image down here, this is the thalamus. And of course, within it, you have specific regions where we have collection of neural cell bodies, which are referred to as the nucleus. So you have one nucleus here, you have another nucleus here. So if you look at it, you see that there are different points where you have collection of these neural cell bodies. And this region are so referred to as nuclei. We say that the thalamus act as relay stations. So they are relay sites for different pathways before they are finally terminated on the cerebral cortex. If you look at the position of the thalamus, using this image up here, we say that this structure that is highlighted here in green and arrowed in red is the thalamus. If you look at the position, you see that it is like a gate channel between the cerebral hemisphere and also the subcortical regions. So you see that this is a point of interface where the neuron will be intercepted before they are finally terminated on the cerebral cortex. So you have afferent and efferent fibers running to and fro the thalamus, whereby creating like a relay site through which these fibers would run. So going further, before driving in on the different thalamic nuclei, it is good for us to establish the white matter covering that is seen to surround the thalamus. This will help us in highlighting the position of some of the thalamic nuclei as we go through with this lecture. So we actually have a white matter covering around the thalamus. So the thalamus is not exposed. This is where we have the different subdivisions of the thalamic nuclei. So this is where we have the anterior view. This is where we have the posterior view behind. This is where we have the medial side, and this is where we have the lateral side. In anatomical position, this is how the thalamus is placed. So this configuration here is what the thalamus represents. And you have white matter covering surrounding the thalamus. We have a section of the white matter covering lining the superior surface of the thalamus, and this is what is referred to as the stratum zonale. So you have these strands of nerve fibers lining the superior surface of the thalamus, and this is what is highlighted here in blue. You see this extension, it's just limited to the superior surface of the thalamus, and this is what is referred to as the stratum zonale. So you see another extension of white matter covering extending, but only limited to the lateral side of the thalamus. Remember, we already established the lateral side of the thalamus here. So you see the white matter covering extending in this pattern, and this is referred to as the external medullary lamina. And this is what is highlighted here in this image. But this is only limited to the lateral side of the thalamus. You can see that the thalamus, before driving it into the thalamic nuclei, we are trying to establish the covering that it has on its surfaces. So you need to remove the white matter covering before we then drive into establishing the different thalamic nuclei that we have. So let's follow through with this lecture to have this unfolded. So in describing the configuration of the thalamic nuclei, it is good for us to establish the inner white matter that tends to divide the thalamus into the sub-regions that it is made up of. So we have a Y-shaped white matter structure that is referred to as the internal medullary lamina. And this is the configuration of the Y-shaped structure. It has 3 limbs. It has 2 short limbs at the anterior part, and at the posterior part it has 1 long limb. These are the 2 short limbs here, arrowed in blue, and we have 1 long limb here that is arrowed here in brown. If you look at this structure here, this is where we have the thalamus, and this is the anatomical position. This is the anterior side, this is the posterior side. So we have the medial side, and this is the lateral side. And if you remember what we described in our previous slide about the white matter covering, which had the stratum zonale and also the external medullary lamina, we see that this covering are seen to overlie the superior and the lateral surfaces of the thalamus. So if you remove this sheet, this is what will be exposed. So this is the kind of configuration that we'll be seeing. A Y-shaped band of white matter will be seen at the internal part. And this is what is referred to as the internal medullary lamina. If you go back to our previous slide, remember we described the external medullary lamina, which of course is also a white matter structure that is seen to cover the thalamus. But this is only limited to the lateral side of the thalamus. So it's good for us to relate the two, the internal medullary lamina and also the external external medullary lamina. So for the internal medullary lamina, as the name describes, it will be seen on the internal or the interior part of the thalamus. So it is not just seen on the interior part of the thalamus, it is also seen to divide the thalamus into three major subnuclei components that it is made up of. So you look at this configuration here, you have it dividing the thalamus into three major nuclear groups. So we have three major nuclear groups. We have the anterior thalamic nuclear group, and as the name implies, it is located in the anterior part. If you look at it, this is the anterior position, this is the posterior position. Because it is a Y-shaped configuration of white matter, it will be having three limbs, which means that whatever structure that it is embedded within will be dividing this structure into three subregions because of these three limbs that it presents. So you have in the anterior part here that is arrowed in blue, this is the anterior thalamic nuclear group. Then you have the second nuclear group, which is the medial thalamic nuclear group. Just as the name implies, it is located towards the medial region. And of course, this is the medial side of the thalamus. Then you have the last sub-region, which is the lateral thalamic nuclear group. And this is what is arrowed here in purple. So you can see that this nuclear group has so established based on the Y-shaped pattern of the white matter that is seen within the thalamus. And this is referred to as the internal medullary lamina. These three are the chief nuclei of the thalamus. We also have other nuclei that are located around this space, and that will be discussed during the course of this lecture. If you also go further, going through our previous slide, we described the external medullary lamina. This external medullary lamina, we say that it's also made up of white matter, but it's seen as a covering outside the thalamus, but of course limited to only the lateral side of the thalamus. This is the stratum zonale that is highlighted here in blue. We know that this structure is also a white matter structure, but it is limited to the superior surface. And this is the pattern by which the stratum zonale, of course, run, covering the superior surface of the thalamus. We also have an extension of the white matter covering that is seen to be limited to just the lateral side. And this is what is highlighted here in this region. So if you look at the external medullary lamina that is seen as a white matter covering limited to just the lateral side of the thalamus, you see that it is related to the lateral thalamic nuclear group and also the anterior thalamic nuclear group. This external medullary lamina does not have any structural relation with the medial thalamic group. So if you look at the pattern by which it runs, you see that its relation is only limited to two of the major thalamic nuclear group, and this is what is presented in this image, and it's good for us to be able to highlight this. This will help us in establishing the position of these structures. So you see that the pattern by which it runs, it is related to the anterior thalamic nuclear group at the front, and also on the lateral side, which is related to the lateral thalamic nuclear group. So let's drive in on each of the thalamic nuclear group. The first one is the anterior thalamic nuclear group, just as the name implies, and also just as we described in our previous slide, it is located in the anterior part. So you see the anterior thalamic nuclear group located between the two short limbs of the internal medullary lamina. This is the internal medullary lamina here highlighted in red, and we say that the internal medullary lamina has two short limbs at the front and one longer limb behind, and this is what is configured in this image. So in between the two short limbs, this is where we have one short limb, this is the second short limb. So these two limbs, in between them is where we have the anterior thalamic nuclear group, and this is what is presented here in this image. What the anterior thalamic nuclear group, what they do basically is to create connection with the limbic system, and as they do this, they help to control emotion and also memory. So this is the function that this anterior thalamic nuclear group are involved in due to the connection that they create with the limbic system. Then going further on the medial thalamic nuclear group. The medial thalamic nuclear group, just as the name implies, is located around the medial side of the thalamus. They can also be referred to as the medial dorsal nuclei or the dorsal medial nuclei. So you can interchange the medial with the dorsal it still will mean the medial nuclear group. So if you look at this point here that is arrowed in blue, this is where we have the interthalamic adhesion. The interthalamic adhesion is a point that is created on the medial surface of the thalamus, through which the thalamus on one side is connected to the thalamus on the other side. If you look at it, around this side, of course, close to the medial side, we have the medial thalamic nuclei. And this is what is arrowed here in yellow. And if you look at the specific location of this medial thalamic nuclear group, you see that it is positioned around the medial side of the long leaf of the internal medullary lamina. This is the internal medullary lamina here, arrowed in black. And if you look at the medial thalamic nuclear group, you see that it is located on the medial side of the long limb of the internal medullary lamina. The internal medullary lamina, as we projected in our previous slide, we said that it has two short limbs and one long limb. And this is the short limb here that is arrowed in black. This is the second short limb here, also on this other side. So you see that the medial thalamic nuclear group is specifically located around the medial side of the long limb of the internal medullary lamina. And this is the long limb of the internal medullary lamina. And this is the medial side. This is the lateral side. So you see that it is located at the medial side of the long limb of the internal medullary lamina. And this is also guided anteriorly by the short limb of the internal medullary lamina. So this is the specific description of where the medial thalamic nuclear group is located. And this structure is also designed for memory and also emotion. Going to the last major subregion of the thalamic nuclei, we have the lateral thalamic nuclear groups. And this is the region on the lateral side of the thalamus. This is where we have the lateral side of the thalamus, and this region is where we have a collection of nuclear points that are referred to as the lateral thalamic nuclei. This structure is configured in a double layered pattern. So you have a group of nuclei in the upper part, then you have another group of nuclei in the lower part. So if you look at this region, this is where we have the lateral thalamic nuclei here, carved out in dotted black. If you look at this configuration, you see that it is designed like a doubled layered structure. So you have a collection of nuclei at the upper part, and you have another group also at the lower part. The group of nuclei that you see in the upper part are referred to as the dorsal tier nuclei, while the group of nuclei that are seen at the lower part are referred to as the ventral tier nuclei. The dorsal group of nuclei is what you see at the upper part, while the ventral group of nuclei is what you see at the lower part. So this we should take note of when we are trying to establish the different subdivisions in terms of nuclear points of the lateral thalamic nuclear group. If we have this at the back of our mind, we would be able to establish the different sub of the lateral thalamic nuclear group, because this is actually the largest of all the three, and it is further subdivided into different sub-regions. Then driving into the upper layer, which are the dorsal nuclear group, we say that the dorsal nuclear group are located above, while the ventral nuclear group are located below. So for the dorsal nuclear group, the first one we have is the lateral dorsal nucleus. This is the lateral dorsal nucleus here, arrowed in this position. It is the lateral because it is on the lateral side of the thalamus, and also is one of the dorsal group of nuclei, because we say that the dorsal group are in the superior or the upper side. So it is referred to as the lateral dorsal nucleus. This lateral dorsal nucleus does not really have an established function, but it's been projected to be related to the limbic system. If you look at these strands here connecting the anterior thalamic nuclear group also with the lateral dorsal nucleus, and because of this connection, it's able to tap from the function that the limbic system establishes. And that is why it's been projected to have functions that are related to the anterior thalamic nuclear group. Then the second nuclear group that is located also in the upper part, which we say is a dorsal group of nuclei, is the lateral posterior nucleus. And this lateral posterior nucleus is what is arrowed here in yellow. You can see it is located behind the lateral dorsal nucleus. So this is the lateral because it's on the lateral side. And it is posterior because it is located at the posterior side of the thalamic group of nuclei. So this is what is harrowed here in yellow. And the function of this lateral posterior nucleus is related to vision and auditory signals. So it helps in the integration of these two sensory pathways. And this is established as a result of its connection with the pulvina. And if you look at this strands of fibers here, at the posterior side, which is where we'll be getting to next, is the pulvina. So it tends to create a connection point with the pulvina. And we know that the pulvina is involved in the integration of sensory signal. And that is why it's also able to tap from this function. So also going further to the last set of the dorsal nuclear group, which of course is located in the upper level or the upper part of the lateral thalamic nuclear group, we have the pulvina. This is the pulvina here, harrowed in white. It is at the most posterior end of the thalamus. And this, of course, is the largest nucleus of the thalamus. The function is sensory related. And this is established as a result of the connection that it forms with other thalamic nuclei. It is also seen to form connection with the geniculate bodies. We know that the medial and the lateral geniculate bodies are involved in visual and also auditory signal. And if you look at it, it has a connection with these two geniculate bodies. So it's also able to help also in contributing to sensory related function. And also if you go further, as we've described before, on the lateral posterior nuclei that is already in yellow, we said that this also is involved in the integration of visual and also auditory signal because of the connection point that it creates with the pulvina. So you can see how this link exists, where one thalamic nuclei connects with the other and also helping to integrate the functions that they exhibit all together. So this is how that is established. Then going further to the ventral group of nuclei, which of course are seen at the lower part of the lateral region of the thalamus. This is the upper region. So in the lower part, remember we described it as a two-layered structure on the lateral part. So it appears that the lateral thalamic nuclei here is more complicated than what is seen or presented in the anterior and also the medial thalamic nuclear group. So for the lateral thalamic nuclear group, we already described the upper collection of nuclei. And of course, these are referred to as the dorsal nuclear group. So for the ventral nuclear group, which of course are located at the inferior part, the first one that we have is the ventral anterior nuclei here that is harrowed here in black. It is ventral because we say that the ventral collection are located at the inferior part, and it is anterior because it is the most anterior part. So if you try to establish how these names are staged, you will be able to understand the specific positions of this nuclei. It is responsible for motor planning and execution. Ventral lateral nucleus. This is the ventral lateral nucleus here, arrowed in green. It is the ventral group of nuclei, and of course it is on the lateral side. It also presents similar function with the ventral anterior nucleus, also in the execution of motor planning action. So this is what they are involved in. Then the third group of the ventral group of nuclei is the ventral posterior nucleus. This is the ventral posterior nucleus. It is at the posterior side. You can see how the names are being drafted. It is ventral because it is the ventral group of nuclei. We already stated this when we started with this slide, that the ventral group are located in the inferior part, while the dorsal group of nuclei are located in the superior part. So for the inferior part that we have the ventral group of nuclei, at the most posterior end, we have the ventral posterior nucleus. And this is the region here. And this ventral posterior nucleus is further subdivided into two. We have the ventral posterior medial nucleus, which is referred to as the VPM, and this is what is harrowed here in blue, which of course is more directed towards the medial side. You can see this region here is directed towards the medial region. While more on the lateral side, we have the ventral posterior lateral nucleus, and this is referred to as the VPL. So you see that the ventral posterior nucleus, that of course is on the ventral group of nuclei, but it is located at the most posterior part, is further subdivided into two. You have the ventral posterior medial and you have the ventral posterior lateral. So these two is what is taken as the ventral posterior nucleus. So you see how these nuclear groups are established. But knowing the details and the position on how they are established will enhance easy understanding and would be able to state specifically where each of these nuclei are located, especially in the lateral thalamic nuclear group, which of course appears to be more complicated. What the ventral posterior nucleus is responsible for sensory function. So they are involved in creating relay sites for sensory pathway. If you look at the ventral posterior medial nucleus, this is specifically designed for sensory informations that are limited to the head and neck region. And this basically involves the trigeminal pathway. If you've studied the trigeminal pathway, you see that the ventral posterior medial nucleus is a point of intercept before they are finally terminated on the cerebral cortex. Then the ventral posterior lateral nucleus is responsible for sensory information of the remaining part of the body. So if you study the sensory pathway, you see that the ventral posterior lateral nucleus, especially the dorsal column-medial lemniscal pathway, you see that we pass through this region of the thalamus before they are finally terminated on the cerebral cortex. So these three are the basic subdivisions of the thalamus. We also have other nuclei that are seen within the thalamus. So let's drive further to see how these nuclei are established. I haven't described the chief nuclei of the thalamus, which include the medial, the lateral, and also the anterior thalamic group of nuclei. These three nuclei are the chief or the major nuclei of the thalamus that are created or formed as a result of the alignment, which is the Y-shaped configuration that is seen within the thalamus. We describe the anterior, the medial, and also the lateral group of nuclei. We'll be describing additional 4 thalamic nuclei that are located outside the space. These are also important and also involved in specific functions. So the first one we'll talk about is the midline nucleus. The midline nucleus, from the name, it is located along the midline. If you go back to the medial thalamic group of nuclei, this is where we have the medial thalamic group of nuclei here, harrowed here at this point. The more medial to this region is where we have the midline nucleus. This midline nucleus is what is seen here to be harrowed in white. This is located along the midline border, and of course is responsible for emotion-related function. And this is also, of course, an additional thalamic nuclei that is positioned around the space. Then the next one is the intramedullary nuclei. This intramedullary nuclei can also be referred to as the intralamina nuclei. As the name implies, remember we described this Y-shaped configuration here that tends to divide the thalamus into the 3 major subgroups of thalamic nuclei that we initially established. This is where we have the internal medullary lamina. This is the structure here, harrowed in blue. And within the internal medullary lamina is where we have this intramedullary nuclei. Intra means within. So there are a group of nuclei that are located within the internal medullary lamina, is what is harrowed here in black. And this group of nuclei are responsible for attention and also arousal. Then the third type of nucleus that we have outside the major sub that we've described is the reticular nucleus. This reticular nucleus is what actually prompted the establishment of the external medullary lamina. Remember when we started this lecture, we said that the thalamus is covered by a wrap of white matter sheets that is referred to as the stratum zonale in the superior part, and also external medullary lamina in the lateral part. If you look at the position, this is where we have the stratum zonale in the superior part. While on the lateral part, we have the establishment of a covering that is made up of white matter, and this is referred to as the external medullary lamina. And this is the way it runs here in this image. So you see it is only limited to the lateral side of the thalamus. Outside the external medullary lamina is where we have the placement of the reticular nucleus. This reticular nucleus is what is highlighted here in blue. And you see it's located outside the space where we have the external medullary lamina. What they do basically is to regulate neural function. And the next thalamic nuclear group are the geniculate nuclei. For some tests, this may not be included as part of the thalamic nuclei. It actually depends on the text that we are reading, but it's good for us to establish this in case we come across this during the course of study. So at the posterior side of the thalamus, this is where we have the posterior view. You have the medial geniculate body here highlighted in brown, and we have the lateral geniculate body here highlighted in green. So we have these two geniculate bodies here located at the posterior part of the thalamus. And we know that the medial geniculate nucleus basically is responsible for auditory signal, while the lateral geniculate nucleus is responsible for visual signal. If we go through our lecture on the auditory and the visual pathway, you will be able to relate and also establish these facts. So these are the different nuclei that we have within the thalamus, and also other supporting or additional nuclei that are also seen and also contributing to the function of the thalamus. In a subsequent lecture, we would be establishing how these actions are exhibited. So thanks for watching this video. Let's continue to stay glued to this channel.